Representation matters. But as indigenous Chicano people, we can't just sit back and wait for mainstream media outlets to make it happen for us. And nor should we. We started the Tales from Aztlantes podcast because we believe that it is imperative for Chicanos, Chicanas, and Chicanx people to produce our own media and tell our own stories. And the way we choose to do this is by using Buzzsprout to host the podcast. Buzzsprout is by far the easiest and best way to launch a professional podcast. You'll get a podcast website, audio players that you can drop into other websites, detailed analytics to see how people are listening, tools to promote your episodes, and much more. To start your own podcast and get a $20 Amazon gift card, follow the link in the show notes. This lets Buzzsprout know that we sent you and helps support the show. Buzzsprout, the easiest way to start a podcast. Now, on with the show.
You must excuse me. I've grown quite weary.
This hasn't been easy, I know. But you've learned a lesson. A lesson in honesty. Honesty to yourself and honesty to others. That lesson will stand you in good stead all your life.
I think we've all learned a good lesson. I've always heard that honesty is the best policy. Now I'm catching on to why that's so, and 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 why that's so.
Yali no Chime, and welcome to Tales from Aztlantes, the show where we explore Mesoamerican pseudohistory, New Age nonsense, and other stories of adventure. We are your hosts, Kurly Tlapoyawa
and Ruben Arellano, also known as Tlakatekatl.
Welcome, dear listeners, to episode 10 of Tales from Aztlantes. We're going to switch it up a little bit on this episode and do our very first crossover with the Reality Dysfunction podcast. We've recorded this interview with Ruben and I and the host of the Reality Dysfunction, Dr. Ernesto Mireles, as a way to explain our positions and give our listeners a better understanding of who we are and where we come from and what our goals are with this podcast. I encourage you to look up the Reality Dysfunction on whatever podcatcher that you use and give it a listen because it's a really, really good podcast. It's described as broadcasting from occupied territories, a space where diverse groups of brown folk from across the nation can explore the political experiences in the social future of the Chicano community, control the narrative, resist the dysfunction. The Reality Dysfunction is hosted by Ernesto Mireles. He's a professor of social justice studies at Prescott College and the author of the award-winning book, Insurgent Aztlan. So, here we go with our very first crossover. I hope you enjoy this episode of Tales from Aztlantes.
Greetings, Dysfunctionals. Dr. Ernesto back today with Kurly Tlapoyawa and Dr. Ruben Arellano to talk with them about their new podcast, Tales from Aztlantes. For all of you out there who are reading and working to uncover and recover our indigenous past, these two brothers are doing solid work in uncovering the encroachments of Western thought on indigenous thought. This is good stuff. But before we get into it, let's have these two introduce themselves.
Okay, well, my name is Ruben Arellano, known as Tlakatekatl, and I'm a professor of history. I teach history, and I've been doing that for about 5 to 6 years now, professionally. Received my PhD in history, master's. I went through the ethnic studies program. So I'm versed in ethnic studies, history of, anthropology, you name it. But I've been studying, things related to Chicano history, Mexican history since I was a kid, since I was a teenager. I used to go to the library and check out books, interested in my background, my history, back when, Chicanismo was in the 90s, the mid to late 90s. Or early to mid 90s, because it started fading in the late 90s, but it was still, a cool thing to say that you were Chicano in many places, to claim that, not only Mexicano, Mexican American, but also Chicano. And so that's that's how I got into Mexicayot, in the late 90s, 99, 2000, and got into danza. I was a danzante for a while, did ceremony, Mexica sweat lodges, went to Wirikuta a number of times with Macalpuli here in Dallas, done ceremony with Huicholes, with Raramuris, with Maya, I mean, you name it, northern ceremonies as well with the NAC and Coahuiltecos recently in the last 4 to 5 years. So I've been in the tradicion one way or another for a good 20 something years at this point. And so that's what I bring to the discussion in terms of the podcast that we have going on, the Tales from Atlantis.
My name is Kurly Tlapoyawa. I am an archaeologist working in the state of New Mexico. I'm a professor of Chicano Studies at the prestigious Colegio Chicano del Pueblo, a free online learning institution that specializes in Chicano Studies. And I am one of the co-hosts of Tales from Atlantis. I got first introduced into, the danza azteca around 1992 during one of the 500 years of resistance events that was being held at the University of New Mexico. I saw a group of danzantes performing, and I was just really attracted to it. The drum, the smell of the copal, just seeing the dance. I knew that it was something that I really wanted to be a part of. So I started dancing here locally with one of the local calpulis. From there, I just went full on into exploring as much about my culture as I could. I'm a child of the Chicano movement, so I always grew up with a very strong political identity. I just grew up around that in Southern Colorado. It was pretty contentious during the Chicano movement. A lot of violence, a lot of police violence, car bombing, stuff like that. So that's just kind of like the environment that I grew up in. So I had this very strong political identity. But it's funny because my mom was always kind of giving me hell, like, yeah, all this about politics, but what do you know about this? What do you know about your culture? What do you know about your history? And so she kind of really guided me along. She gave me all of her old Chicano Studies books from when she was in school, just really guided me on that path. And eventually, I moved to Mexico. I went to a lot of ceremonies. I danced with the Mexicayot, with Anawak Tlamachtiloyan. Every weekend there in the Zócalo, I was there studying Nahuatl, studying my family's history. And then when I came back, I moved to Texas, and that's where I met Ruben. And we just kind of fell into the same group and became really good friends. And a lot of the same stuff, doing medicine meetings, going to different danza events. I used to host a Nahuatl study circle at my house. We would just get together all the time and trade ideas. It was about that time, I was like a hardcore student of Mexicayot, right? Like I wanted to be the most down Azteca that I could be. And so I just read voraciously every piece of information that I could. And, it was, Ruben and I were always kind of the, I don't want to say the troublemakers, but, we were the ones that, what's that?
The odd men out.
Yeah. We were the ones that were always questioning things. I think it was just in our nature we would hear something, we'd be like, what'd you think about that when that guy said this? And but it would be by ourselves, right? We wouldn't say it out in front of everybody else because we didn't know how other people were going to respond to it. But we started hearing, you'd hear some things in ceremony or from other people that were coming through Texas and, spreading their teachings. And we would just kind of like shoot each other a look like, did you hear that? And then we would regroup later and do our own research and look into it. Like, well, where's this stuff coming from?
Yeah. For example, did you know that Citlali is our first home? That's where we come from. We come from the stars.
Citlali.
Because you break down the word Citlali, it's Se, Tlali, Se, one, Tlali, earth.
So one land, because we come from the Pleiades. And I remember we were in the same ceremony when somebody said that, and everybody's sitting around the circle. There's a fire going, and you could see everybody nodding their heads like, yeah. And Ruben and I just kind of like stare at each other from across the circle. Like, did you just hear it? What?
All right.
Star Trek music.
Yeah, that kind of set off our whole endeavor, which has culminated in this podcast where we're finally just kind of putting it all out there.
I want to say, at the risk, I don't know about the cyst, but at the risk of sounding like a total fanboy, really into the podcast, looking forward to the other episodes, Tales from Atlantis. And so, like, Kurly, I've been following your work for a while. This isn't the first time that you've been on the podcast, on the Reality Dysfunction. I really appreciate you coming back to talk about this. And Ruben, it's really nice to meet you. I've also been following the work that you're doing. And so, I've just been listening to this podcast over the last couple of days, really just kind of blown away by the way that you guys are approaching it. I mean, it's very factual. It's very matter of fact. I know before we started recording, you all had said something about how people are charging you with being sarcastic about your culture. I don't pick that up at all. It seems to me that there's really very little sarcasm. I think that might be actually the problem with a lot of people. It's like you said at the end of your first podcast, Kurly, the truth, it doesn't, it's like medicine. It doesn't always taste good, but it's good for you. I know where the information for this podcast comes from, but what was the sort of process that you all went through to arrive at this moment? Like, we need to do this.
It's an idea that we'd been kicking around for a while, right? And then finally we were just like, we should do it. Because we had talked about it before. And I'm a big fan of this one podcast that I listen to a lot that kind of inspired me to just finally sit down and write out a structure of like, okay, if we do it, this is how we should do it. And then we just talked one day and set a date and a time. We're like, let's just try it. And recorded.
So I started a podcast with a colleague of mine when I was out in El Paso a couple of years ago, and it's unfortunate the distance, and we're both kind of busy. He's a professor of history as well, and we just couldn't keep it up. And we talked about keeping it up, and we just couldn't do it. So that's where I got my start. But before doing that podcast, I had been very intimidated by the whole idea of doing a podcast. I didn't know the first thing about, because to me it seemed like doing a radio show, but it's online. And as opposed to a radio show where, you tune in, you listen to it, and if you missed it, oh well. With this, it's like anyone can access it at any time, as long as it's up on the internet. Someone can download it and share it, and that can get a little intimidating if you're kind of old school like me and you're not really used to, I didn't grow up, wanting to be a radio host, so But I think this idea of sharing our knowledge is something that we've been talking about for a long time. And so we've done it over the years through various media. We started doing it. You could say that it really started back in the old Mexica Eagle Society discussion boards that we used to have back in the early aughts into the early teens. And then after that, you had other platforms. That's when Facebook came around, and then Twitter. And so people started migrating to those spaces. And so we sort of migrated too. And then people started, getting into the whole blog thing. And so we decided to give it a shot there. And so that's where the idea for the Mexica.org, transitioning from the old Mexica Society type of website to a more blog focused website came into, being. And so that's where we started to write and share our ideas, our thoughts, our ever-evolving sort of notion of what it means to be a Mexica within Mexicayot, and, what does it mean to be indigenous in terms of the indigeneity of one's person, and so that, we've written about this stuff over the years, and we've kind of tossed around the idea of doing a podcast once, we realized that people weren't really, you still have some traffic to these websites reading our old material, but it started to dwindle some years ago when people started to, focusing more on content that's more audio and visually related. People don't really have time for whatever reason, to sit down and read something, and everyone's on their phone nowadays. So people want, media that they can consume on their phone. And so what's the best way to do that than through, something that's an audio consumption. So this just made sense, and so now what we're doing is we're sort of recycling some of the old things that we've written over the years and ideas that we've discussed and tossed around over the years. And we're translating that into this podcast medium.
As I've been listening over the last couple of days, I mean, you guys have been going over a whole bunch of stuff, even in these first couple of episodes. I mean, the range is, I think it's pretty astonishing. I guess my biggest question, I mean, as I'm listening to it, I have several questions that I really want to ask you guys, but I think just kind of starting it off, to me, what it seems like is that you have a project that you've begun, and certainly not just in the podcast, but, you know, like Ruben was talking about a second ago, over a period of years through like the websites and the different things, but that it's really about confronting Western encroachment, like thought encroachment, you know, and the way that like the initial missionaries and religious people that came over, it's like a 500-year plus psyops, like this psychological operation where like totally subverting the ideas of the way that indigenous people at the time thought about the world, right? And so I guess part of my question is, why is it so important to confront that encroachment at this point? I mean, 500 years later, there's a whole bunch of things that have happened, you know, politically and culturally, right? I mean, the whole idea of decolonization is alive. I don't know if it's well, but it's alive, right? What difference does it make if Hunabku is something that our ancestors talked about?
Well, as a
that's a loaded question.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there.
I'm sorry.
Well, I can say that as first and foremost, just as even just outside of like a cultural lens, just as a scientist, I want the best, most accurate information possible. Like I want to make my decisions based on solid information.
That's Western thinking, Kurly.
Yeah, right. Well, well-informed decisions.
No, they don't. I don't think Western people, they don't get to capture that. That's
yeah, right. But so, you know, I don't like to be I don't know what's a good word for it, like just embedded in dogma and just have this unchangeable position, right? Like, no, this is what I learned. And because that's what religious fundamentalists do. And I'm not a religious fundamentalist. So I want good information. And so my perspectives will change as you present better information to me, right? And that's not the sole domain of white people, like being able to change your perspective based on good information. And it's funny because I get attacked like that quite a bit, especially on Facebook. People will be like, well, you're as an archaeologist, you're supporting the white man's science, or, you know, you're using books. Our ancestors didn't use books. And it's like, well, actually they did. They burned most of them. That's the problem, is we don't have the records.
The book people.
Yeah, the book people. And so for me, it's important because the truth matters. You know, facts matter. When you can distort history, you can control how people think. You control how people view themselves and view their position in history. And if people are being fed disinformation, deliberate disinformation, then they're being manipulated. And I don't like seeing my people be manipulated. And that's where it comes from for me. You know, I feel a moral and ethical obligation to spread, you know, information, the best information that I can. And, you know, I make mistakes. So, you know, you don't have to agree, or you don't just believe what I'm saying just because it's me saying it. You know, look into it. And here are the resources. You know, we provide citations and resources, and we refer people to primary sources. Like, here, you know, you don't have to agree with us because it's not just coming from us. You could look at the actual, you know, historical record, the archaeological record, and have the information to make an educated, form an educated opinion about these things. So to me, it's like an obligation, just carrying on from, you know, the legacy that my mom left me of caring about my culture 46 years later, I've got to maintain that. I can't just sit quiet while nonsense gets spread. I've always been that way. That's just like my nature. So why nobody likes me.
No nonsense zone? Is that what is it? That's what's happening right now.
Cool story, bro. I think for me, I agree with most of what Kurly's saying there. I might have some disagreements here and there. We all do, and that's the point of one of the things that we bring to the podcast is that we don't necessarily agree on everything. I don't know if you've noticed. We don't make a big deal about it, but we do sort of bounce ideas back and forth. And for me, I think what's important here as well is this idea that people are being deceived into thinking that something is ancient when it really is not, right? And going back to this idea of wanting to get to the facts and wanting to know, the truth in scare quotes, right? As a professor of history, when I tell my students that in history, we're not trying to prove anything. We know what the facts are. Use the facts, use those sources to interpret that history and to say something substantive about it. Why is it important? Why does that specific story matter to us today in the present? Just because something happened in the past doesn't make it history. It's the way that we approach it, the way that we interpret it, that makes it history, because it's something that is important to us. And so I feel that it's important for us as people who subscribe to this idea of indigeneity as Chicanos Mexicanos, that subscribe to Mexicayo or the Red Road or the Tradición, whatever moniker you want to give it, that we are truthful and honest to the new people that are coming on board so that they don't get deceived into thinking that this is an unbroken tradition that dates back to the pre-invasion of the Spanish. So there's truth to the notion that traditions, have evolved since then. It doesn't mean that they remain the same, right? Because anything that stays static is going to stagnate and it's going to die. That's just a truism of life itself. And so to suggest and to try to imply and to try to convince people that this thing that they're doing, that they're being taught, that they're being inculcated in, is some unbroken, untainted tradition that dates back to 500 years. I think that's a disservice to the people, and and you should be honest enough, and you should be able to be honest with yourself as well as a person that's making these pronouncements, to say to those people that, look, we understand that our tradition, when the Spanish came, they did a lot of harm to our culture, to our people, to our society, to our ways of life, to our spirituality. And we've tried to recover that over the years. And this is the best that we've been able to do. But to sit there and also say, some ancient ancestor told such and such, it's like, well, do you really know that? How accurate is that information?
And why does that make it any more meaningful or impactful or powerful?
Yeah.
Our history is legitimate. It's fascinating and meaningful enough without, adding all of this extra stuff to it and making it more fanciful and more, deep. Oh man, you don't understand the way I see things. I have a very deep understanding of the world because this elder taught me this and he didn't get it from a book. It's like, are you sure? Because I've got a book that says that exact same thing. And it's just funny because people, they got this idea that it's not meaningful unless you somehow ascribe some sort of magical thinking to it,
or antiquity to it. Yeah, exactly.
And I think one of the reasons that those people who are saying that we're sarcastic or whatever, maybe they're just picking up on the fact that Ruben and I have known each other for over 20 something years. And when we get together and we talk about things, we're friends. We talk to each other the way friends talk to each other. And that might come across as being
unprofessional
or whatever. But hey,
it's a freaking podcast. And
I'm sure
people, it's like, if you want serious stuff, read my work, which I doubt you will do because it's too long and you don't want to, spend 5 minutes reading stuff. So, please get over yourselves.
Yeah,
if
it's a podcast.
If they want to read, if they want serious stuff, then they can buy my book. Buy my book. And so I think,
I mean, it's the same kind of argument that I've heard from people on Twitter, because on Twitter, I've always been not necessarily a clown, but I like to poke fun at stuff, and people can perceive that the wrong way. And so it's like I tell people, this is Twitter. What do you expect from me? I mean, you want me to publish my dissertation on Twitter? Come on, please.
Yeah. And anybody who's known either of us for any extended period of time just knows our personalities, right? And I tell people, like, hey, I hate to break it to you, but if you're looking for like the deep spiritual elder teacher guru type, that I'm not that guy. I'm just myself. I'm not going to play a character. I grew up the way I grew up. I have my opinions and the way I talk to people, and it just so happens that Ruben and I click really well. Even when we disagree with each other, it's like it never comes to like like an argument or anything. We're able to talk to each other and have disagreements, but we're still friends. And I think that's the biggest lesson of all. Yeah. Is you could disagree with people and not
knock them over the head.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not
and still make each other laugh and still have fun and still enjoy each other's company.
Yeah.
And not call them vendidos just because you disagree with them.
Yeah. Sorry about that, by the way. I was pretty riled up.
Vas a ver, cabrón, cuando te ves.
I really enjoyed the example that you put out about the young Nahua men who were creating new Dia de los Muertos traditions and dances.
In the Huasteca.
Yeah, I think that's the thing is, I mean, for full transparency, I'm not a historian, but what I am, I think more than anything, is sort of a culture person, right? And really thinking about, how culture is dynamic, right? How things are always changing. It's really interesting, to think about those young men creating those new traditions, right? And how everybody, may be so shocked and so mad at them, right now, but 50 or 60 years from now, the full weight of whatever just kind of sets in, and then it becomes the way that we've always done it, and to think about, how that works. And I think for myself, I think about how much energy is wasted in the Chicano movement, politically, culturally, emotionally, or whatever, by people saying, "Oh, that's not the way we do it," or, you're wrong, or and it's just like, it boggles me sometimes.
Yeah,
you gotta do it the Chicano way.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah.
But which Chicano way? The Texas Chicano way? The Michigan Chicano way?
Well, that's the only true way, right? The Texas Chicano way.
Oh, yeah. I have heard people say that, yes.
Well, so and that's one of the things that people get hung up on, is this desire for antiquity without realizing that tradition, this dance in particular, it's very ephemeral. And all it takes is one person turns left once instead of right, and then they teach it that way. Yeah. Well, now you turn left, and then now it's changed forever.
Yeah,
but it's not any less significant.
One person to take the poposhkomet, put it in the center of the dance arena, and put their foot over it, and call it the fire dance or something.
Yeah,
that's technically what happened with that danza. It wasn't a conchero tradition at all. It was invented by none other than who was it?
That would be was that Florencio?
Yeah, that was Florencio.
Yeah,
yes.
Florencio.
That was his invention. And now you see it. It's a standard dance trope that you see most danzantes do in public appearances. It's like,
I've done it.
They get up there and they put the incense burner, and then they do this little dance and sing a little song and make a little noise.
Down tonight.
That's funny. I guess part of my question is as I was listening to it, like I was taking in everything that you guys were saying, the way that you're exposing a lot of these ideas or these concepts, the whole discussion around Ometeot. I mean, blew me away, man. Seriously, blew me away. Because I was just like, because I would have never known any of that, right? And so it's because I probably also wouldn't have taken the time to try to uncover it, so I'm here, I'm listening. You had a moment where you were talking about traditions and how all tradition is created, right, which is obviously true. I guess my question is, with this particular podcast, knowing a little bit about both of you, is what's the political goal of this podcast?
World domination. No.
The same thing we do every night.
Yeah, that's right. We do every day. You know what? It's just to uplift people's standards, really. Because look, if you're willing to accept erroneous information uncritically, if you're willing to accept things uncritically, whether it's culturally or politically or whatever, right?
Sacrosanct.
Yeah. You can't question these things. So I'm just trying to get people to open up and think more critically, look more critically at things. And that just spills over, because to have a Chicano identity, that's inherently political, right? That's inherently a political statement to say that you're a Chicano.
Yeah.
And if you're going to accept things uncritically, well, that's not good for anybody. So hopefully by presenting like, look, hey, we're involved in this tradition. We are, reasonably educated people, and we've come to these conclusions, and we question things. And that's just going to spill over, as a political goal. I don't know if we have any specific political goal, but I would say that my personal goal is just to produce better informed Chicanos who are able to look at things critically and skeptically, and have the ability to deconstruct things, whether it's in the political realm, the cultural realm, spiritual, whatever they want to do, just to be able to come at it from this perspective, like, well, I don't have to believe this just because an elder says it, because like I'm often reminded, dumb people get old too,
But Kurly, these are indigenous elders.
Yeah, right.
Doesn't that make a difference?
Yeah, that cracks me up, because people think like, well, just this guy's a native speaker, so therefore everything he says about the culture is 100% accurate. It's like, well, I'm a native English speaker. It doesn't give me any sort of special insight into the English speaking world. Or
tell me about the Queen, Kurly.
Yeah, I know.
But my question to you, Ernesto, is, does it have to be political? I mean, why is there a need for our approach to wanting people to at least know the origin of the things that they subscribe to? Why does that have to have a political angle to it? And what is your interpretation of what we're doing?
Well, for the first part of the question, I would say that everything that we do is inescapably political, particularly as the descendants of colonized indigenous people. I don't think that we really have or can undertake actions that don't have some sort of political consequence or ramification.
But does that inherently make the thing that's being, or the act that's being done, just because there's a political consequence to that, does it make it inherently a political act? Before the consequence was applied to it.
I would say that everything that we do it has a political context. Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
I mean, that's what I would argue. Right. That's how I would answer that question.
Yeah.
I think that it is a particularly. I mean, if you're involved in a project and you use the words culture, then you're committing a political act. Because remember, all culture is made up. I mean, you guys said that in the podcast, right? I mean, if we're talking about breathing or we're talking about taking a crap, but even taking a crap, man, depends on which hand you wipe your butt with. You know what I'm saying? It is, because if you try to shake hands with the wrong hand in certain places, you got a
Lávate
problem.
las manos, cabrón.
So, I mean, I think that's one of the things that has really struck me about this. And the reason that I asked the question is, well, yeah, because I mean, to me, when I listen to this, what I hear you guys really doing is, one, pushing people to think and pushing them to question and to be skeptical. All of these things that were just said. My question, and what I'm thinking is, and I asked this question myself, what's the end goal of this, right? Like, what if we're taking this information out to the community, okay, and we're saying, okay, look, these things right here, here's 5 more ways that they fucking tricked us, right?
Want me to answer that?
Sure.
The end goal is to storm the Teocalis.
Okay. I mean,
well, for me personally, the end goal is, Ruben and I have talked about this a lot, about this possible, is there a way to reform this movement, right? And I'm not going to, be so bold as to say, like, yes, we are going to single-handedly reform this movement. But I think starting the conversation is important. And I've had a lot of feedback on this, the podcast. And
I bet you have.
Before you get into it, does that also make us restorationists of a sort? If we're trying to reform Mexicayo, are we the latest iteration of all those restorationists? I mean, that's something to think about too.
Yeah, we are the latest iteration of
Movimiento Confederado Escepticista
Plus
or Escepticista. I voy con mis chicanadas.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, we could be, but who knows? Who knows what's going to happen?
But not everyone that's a Mexica or follows Mexicayo in the U.S. is a Chicano or identifies as a Chicano.
Yeah.
Right. So a lot of people in my calpuli here in Dallas, a lot of those folks, even if they're native-born ethnic Mexicans, they don't necessarily subscribe to a Chicano identity.
Yeah.
Right. These are people who are maybe half my age or our age, whatever. And they weren't brought up with this idea of thinking of themselves as Chicanos. And so that's not even part of the equation for them. For them, this is a tradition that is, traces its roots to Mexico, to indigenous people of what we consider Mesoamerica, and that has links to the north through, the legend of the Now We Meet and the 4 arrows that were shot in the 4 different directions. And that's how you bring in the Sundance. And that's how you can, pick and choose from various indigenous traditions and to come up and create this new pan-indigenous spiritual approach to your own indigenous identity. Right. And so it's even more complicated than just, applying this to Chicanos, because we have people from Central America, South America. I mean, at one point we had people in our group that were from, I want to say from South America, Guarani. I've met people who are part of the Mexicayo tradition in the broader general sense, who are Puerto Rican from the island, not from like a New Yorican or from the States, right? But from like the island itself. That identify as Boricuas, and they have their own, indigenous tradition, but they sort of latch on to Mexicayo because of the people that they know or what have you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So it's, it's more than just, a politically charged identitarian spiritual movement of Chicanos. It's grown beyond that. You have danza groups in South America, you have danza groups in Europe, in Spain, in Germany, and they're springing up all over the place. I mean, the latest one that I hear of, I think, is there's a Mexicayo Red Road tradition in Japan, right? So this is
that makes total sense, though.
Mexicayo is going global. I mean, it started with the lowriders back in the 80s.
Yeah, I was gonna say, of course there's a dancer group in Japan.
Yeah, well, you've all seen that video of the Japanese cholos, right?
Yeah.
And they all have that. They all love that Chicano identity. I was telling.
But that goes. People think that that's a new thing. I remember
that goes back.
Lowrider magazine. They were publishing pictures of those guys back in the late 80s.
Yeah, and I told Lalo Alcaraz, I was like, bro, pretty soon Japan's going to be the only safe place for Chicanos to go. Because the Latinxers are coming for us.
I think that I mean, obviously, all that is true. I don't think that I don't think it diminishes the political dimension of it at all. Actually, I think that it actually broadens the political dimension of it. But I think that those are good points, man. I mean, I think actually those are great points.
I would say that it's not explicitly political what we're doing, but I guess you can apply political, you can attach it politically to different agendas if you wanted to. Right?
Sure. Yeah.
So
well, I've been encouraged by the response from like old school veterano Chicanos to like young cholos and everything in between, writing me letters, just emails, writing me letters, sitting down with a pen and a quill, sending me messages on Facebook and emails and stuff, just thanking us for putting this information out.
Yeah.
And just saying, man, this is so cool that you're saying this. The older cats are like, I wish something like this existed when I was young, so I could hear alternative perspectives. I get some older cats who've written to me and they're like, bro, these are things that I've been questioning for a long time, but I've never wanted to bring up because of possible repercussions, right?
It's like
my friendships
religion,
and
right?
it's like a religion.
It's like what's that project called where the priests are leaving, they become atheists and and they're trying to find an escape from their church.
Yeah.
It almost sounds like that. It's like you've done something for so long, for 20, 30 years, and you begin to question it at some point. And then, you've invested so much time and effort and resources, and it becomes, for some people, this is their livelihood. This is literally what they do to earn a living. They go around and do ceremonies or limpias or what have you, right? And that's all they do, and they're not getting rich off of it, but that's a source of income for them, right?
Yeah.
And I understand it if someone comes in and tries to challenge what they do, because it's like any other religion. Once you begin to challenge people's core beliefs, it's like you're challenging their identity.
Yeah.
Right? Mm-hmm. That's who they are. That's who they identify as. And for us as Chicano, Mexicanos, Mexicas to be questioning, Mexicano, even though, we've both, spent 20 something years, practicing it and engaging it to the fullest extent of our abilities, it's, even, for us to do that, it's like, how dare you? You're criticizing our culture. You're criticizing people who identify as indigenous, and it's opening the door for others to come in that already don't like us, and to have some, you're giving other people ammunition to come against. It's like, no, it's like we're actually, I think it's in the reverse. I think we're empowering people to know the truth, so that when someone does come at them with facts, they can at least be aware of them, and they're not like blindsided by something that they've never heard of before.
Exactly. And we see that a lot with, because we, in the Chicano community, we have a tendency to lionize our heroes, right? So you're not allowed to question people. And it's the same thing with the Mexicayot stuff. And for me, we're equipping people, right? Like Ruben just said, we're equipping them with better information, so that when, because that enables us to own it, right? We're the ones making the critique. We're the ones making the analysis. And so when our adversaries, people who are adversarial towards us, try to attack us, like Ruben said, they're not getting hit out of nowhere. They're already equipped with this information, and they could say, well, hold on, you need to understand the context of what's going on. And they could defend their position better having this information, as opposed to, we're not allowed to ever question this. And, so you just go along thinking, yeah, okay, I learned this from an elder and I have all this authentic information. And then when they do get blindsided by somebody saying, yeah, but what about the MCRCA? Yeah, but what about this? What about this guy? And they're like, I have no idea what you're talking about,
It's like I tell my students early on, especially the students that take the first part of U.S. history, and we begin talking about indigenous people, the pre-invasion period, the different societies that existed in North and Central and South America. And then once we get into the initial encounter, I tell students, how do you think that the Europeans were able to come to the Americas and initiate everything that came thereafter. And then you get the usual, oh, Columbus this, oh, they had ships, they have better equipment to, better tools, better weapons, yada, yada, yada. And I'm like, okay, perhaps. But what if we look at it in terms of our own current moment? What is our own current moment? We're in the information age. What benefited Europeans and the way that they were able to arrive here first, and as opposed to Americans arriving in Europe, in the reverse, right? The reverse scenario is that they had better information. They had better information that they had acquired from, peoples in Africa, people in the Middle East, people in the Far East, and in places in Asia. And so they were, when Europeans finally arrived at a moment where they were able to traverse the globe on a ship, they had better information in general, as opposed to our ancestors who had been isolated in these continents, and they only had a certain amount of information. They were getting to that place. They were approximating, the old world, if, to put it in those terms, but they were behind in information, technology, etc. Right. So it wasn't so much that the Europeans were better at anything than our ancestors. They just happened to benefit from having more information at a specific moment in time.
Yeah.
And so if we don't have today the descendants of those people that suffered because of that lack of information, if we're going to continue that process of being uninformed or misinformed, then we're going to be just as bad as they were. And it happened to them because they didn't know. And if it happens to us, whatever happens to us, because it's going to be because we are willfully misinformed and uninformed, because we don't want to, venture out and seek other alternative versions to the things that we already consider to be gospel, right?
Yeah.
It's part of the same mentality that you have to question. I got this from one of the elders who responded to me personally about the podcast. He said, you have to question everything. And this is coming from someone who's also, been in the tradition for 40, 50 years. And he agrees to that.
Yeah.
That he might not agree with everything that we are saying, or maybe he doesn't know a lot of the stuff that we're, uncovering. But he agrees that we should question it at least.
Yeah. I know when I left church, I decided I was never going to go back. It didn't matter what it looked like. And so, I mean, I've stuck with that. And I feel what you guys are doing, like all the way down. I feel it. I've seen these conversations happen. I've seen the finger pointing, the denunciation that comes along with it. The whole like spiritual thing. I mean, where like people are like, I just know because like the spirit tells me, and like this, old guy told me, and I'm just like, wow, like I can't roll with that, not for 1 second. So, I mean, I feel what, I feel what you guys are doing. We're almost out of time. I just want to give you both one last opportunity to, say whatever it is that you want to about your podcast, where people can catch it at, anything like that. And I really appreciate both of you taking your time to come talk to me.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Yeah, absolutely.
You could catch it on any of the major podcatchers. I think it's iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, all that stuff. I'm a little behind, but I've been trying to put them up on YouTube as well. Some people like to listen. It's funny. I've actually had quite a few people message me and ask me, like, how do you listen to a podcast? So you got to educate people on how to interact with the technology too.
Well, just so you all know out there, if you have an Alexa in your house, you can tell Alexa to play Tales from Atlantis. And
it recognizes it?
I haven't tried yours yet. I know it does mine, but mine is also on iTunes. So I think if it does mine, it should probably do yours too. Sometimes it takes Alexis a couple of times, but
so you're putting out misinformation there, brother.
I know, right?
Now we've got some cool episodes that are coming up. There's one that's going to drop next week. We're not going to tell you what it is. You're just going to have to wait and find out. And we've got a lot more material. It's not just going to deal with necessarily, spirituality is going to also delve into things that are historical, and we're also going to bring it to, you know, more contemporary subjects that relate to Chicanismo in general and other adjacent topics. So
I like that word, adjacent topics.
There you go.
So it allows us to explore outside of, you know, strictly Mexicayot, because the cool thing about the Mexicayot stuff is the further you dig into it, you figure out that these guys really had an influence on just about every single aspect of Chicano identity.
Yeah.
You could find some connection to back in time to these original founders of the Mexicayot, whether you want to admit it or not, you know, whether you know it or not, because I didn't know this stuff for the longest time. And, you know, when you start learning it, you know, I always say, I don't want to compare myself to Malcolm X, but I can imagine how he felt when he realized that the Nation of Islam was like a bunch of horse shit, and just this feeling of betrayal and dejection and like, oh man, what have I been doing? But then, you know, that's enabled me to kind of watch from the sidelines for a little bit and say, okay, well, this is actually good. You know, this stuff is good. This stuff not so good. And I'm able to have a more discerning eye, you know. And I think that's, if we could equip people to even do that much, just to look at it and be like, well, that seems shaky, but this has value. So what can we do with this? And, you know, and how can we convince other people to get rid of this other stuff that has no value and then focus more on legitimate, I don't even like using that word, but more stuff that has value, stuff that benefits our sense of who we are and our culture. Because I still go to ceremony, you know, I still do danza. I enjoy it. I still go to ceremony. I enjoy it, but I don't do it for the same reasons maybe that I was doing it before.
Do it for the fellowship and the camaraderie and, you know. And
just like even there is cultural continuity, you know, there. It's not as old as people might think, but I like being part of that, you know, because if you look at it, hey, powwow isn't that old.
Right.
No. Native American church isn't that old.
And they'll admit it. So, you know, they're not going to go around saying powwow's been around for millennia. Like, no.
Yeah. And so, you know, for us to look at danza and be like, yeah, this isn't as old as we thought it was, but it's still, it has a tradition. It has protocols. It has a history. It has things that matter.
And those things are legit.
Yeah. And it's enjoyable. And it's part of who we are. And we don't need to, you know, add false history to it to make it better.
Yeah.
To make it seem legitimate.
Yeah.
So follow us on Twitter at Atlantis Tales. And do you have Instagram for this, Kurly? I know you do the Instagrams. I don't.
I mainly, I mean, I have an okay Instagram following, so I've just been using my personal one to promote. So just Kurly Tlapoyawa, Instagram and Twitter.
And my personal Twitter is at Tlakatekatl.
And chimali.org is the website. Maybe you should spell Tlakatekatl.
Yeah.
I think so.
A lot of people don't know how to spell. How do you spell that? Tlakatekatl. Tlakatekatl.
All right, guys. Thanks. I appreciate it. I'm looking forward to the next time.
This is the Reality Dysfunction.
Thank you for listening to Tales from Atlantis, a project of the Chimali Institute of Mesoamerican Arts. If you enjoy the show, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter. You can do this by visiting talesfromastlantis.com and clicking Support the Podcast. Your continued support will help keep the podcast ad-free and independent. Until next time, Timo Itase.